Hello, everyone. My name is Austin Alvarez, and I'd like to welcome you to the Empowered Podcast live stream event. Do I have PFAS forever chemicals in my blood? And on this special episode, we're going to be taking a deep dive into PFAS, what it is, where it is, the major health concerns linked to it, and how to test your own PFAS blood levels at home. And today I'm here with some great friends and PFAS experts. How's it going, everybody? So first, we actually have Erin Jerger. She's a registered dietitian and director of commercial ops at EmpowerDX. If you want to say hey. Erin.
Hi, glad to be here.
And next is Dr. Travis Wilkes, family practice physician and medical director of EmpowerDX. How's it going, Travis?
Great. Thanks, Austin.
Mm-hmm. And we also have Taryn McKnight, the PFAS practice leader at our environmental laboratory.
Hey, everyone.
And we have Andrew Patterson, the PFAS technical director at our environmental lab. So today's topic is, do I have PFAS forever chemicals in my blood? So where do we start, Erin?
Well, we should probably just get the basic question out of the way. I know there's probably all different levels of people calling in interested about PFAS. You may already know a lot about it or not very much and just eager to learn. So what are PFAS and how many PFAS chemicals are there?
I'll take that one, Erin. So,
Okay.
First of all, thank you to everybody for joining. We've been looking to support EmpowerDX through our environmental laboratory. I'm coming to you from just outside of Sacramento, California, where a lot of the method development took place for the blood test. So, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. What are PFAS? The acronym stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And really, you might have heard these called PFCs in the past, or PFOS and PFOA, which are two of the thousands of PFAS that are out there. So PFAS are compounds that in all in common, they have a backbone of carbon chain backbone bound to a certain number of fluorines. And then on the other side of the compound, we're not going to get into structures or anything. There's a functional group, and those two elements, the long chlorofluoro chain and the functional group, really are why these chemicals were synthesized because of their unique chemistry.
Very interesting. And are they naturally occurring or man-made? Where do they come
no,
from?
These are 100% man-made.
Okay.
Really starting in the 40s and 50s. And we should point out that if these compounds stayed where their intended use was to be, that they do have some unique and life-saving properties. The problem is that these aren't staying where they're originally intended, and they're becoming more and more ubiquitous in the environment, or they are ubiquitous in the environment, and we are seeing them really wherever we look. But they are not naturally occurring. So.
Gotcha. And then question for you, why are they called forever chemicals? I've heard that term a lot.
So they're called forever chemicals because they don't have any known degradation pathway. So one may exist that we discover in the future, but for now, there's no way for these to naturally break down in the environment. So as far as we know, they're going to last a very long time. We haven't really come to the end of that point yet. We're not sure how long it'll be.
Interesting.
Yeah, and in fact, sorry to jump on the back there, but that's a whole topic of discussion. In our field, destructive capabilities, destructive technologies. How do we safely get rid of PFAS so that they don't pose any risk to either the environment or to human health?
Yeah, that makes sense. And then what about in the body? So you said in the environment they don't break down very fast at all, but in the body, is it the same thing where it just takes beyond a lifetime, or is there a specific amount of time? Do they have a different half-life per individual PFAS chemical? How does that work?
You're right. So that's what it is. It's a half-life, which refers to the time it takes for your body to eliminate that chemical. And it is chemical dependent. So as Andrew said, there's thousands of these chemicals in this class. And we've really only identified and studied a small subset of them. And based on those studies so far, each chemical has a different half-life. So it can be from hours to years that it takes for your body to eliminate these.
So forever in the environment, but also could be forever almost in your body, or it's very hard to get rid of.
Certainly longer than most people would want these chemicals staying in their bodies.
That makes sense.
And what products contain PFAS?
So that can be a pretty long list of things. I think it's easier to think about the characteristics of these chemicals, and that can help you understand what kind of products you would find them in. So that carbon-fluorine bond that Andrew mentioned is one of the shortest and strongest bonds in nature. So because of that strength, it can impart really valuable characteristics like water repellent, stain repellent, reducing friction and tension. It's used in firefighting chemicals, products. And so it's those characteristics you can start to think of, well, what in my life has some kind of nonstick or water repellent property, clothing and housing materials and that sort of thing.
So speaking of, I wanted to launch a poll to see if everybody was listening just now, and it has to do with products that have PFAS in them. I'm going to launch this poll. Let me know if you can see it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, it's live. Which product does not have PFAS in it? Is it nonstick cookware? Is it stain-resistant cleaning products? Is it firefighting foam? Is it water-resistant flooring? Or all of the above likely contain PFAS? What do you guys think?
Do we get to answer too, Austin?
I think you might know the answer, Mr. Expert.
Don't give them the answer.
Oh, it looks like we had only a couple of them said nonstick. It's actually all of the above likely contain PFAS. So appreciate that.
Good listening out there, everyone.
Now, the bigger question I want to ask is, why should anybody care, though? So PFAS, I mean, it's a chemical that's in our bodies. Does it matter?
I think we got to take a step back from that, Austin. As we learn more about PFAS, we aren't seeing recommended levels for drinking water or for food or for feed or anything increase. We're only seeing these levels decrease as we learn more about the health effects and about the longevity of these chemicals. So, right now, there's only a recommendation in drinking water from the federal government that for PFOA and PFOS, these drinking water have a level less than 70 parts per trillion, or PPT, or 70 nanograms per liter of water. That's a pretty small value, but we're already seeing the fact that state governments in the U.S. have vastly lower limits than 70 PPT. Some are recommending single-digit PPT, 1 or 2 or 3 PPT, and in fact, California has a desired drinking water limit for PFOA of 0.007 PPT, otherwise known as 7 ppq, parts per quadrillion. And really that's outside of the reach right now of any government or private laboratory. But you can see that as we learn more about these chemicals, really we need to be looking at lower and lower levels because of the toxicity that we're finding. And I'm sure Dr. Wilkes is going to chime in here a little bit, but when folks discovered PFAS in the environment, these levels that we were looking at, the instrumentation couldn't see as low as it can now, and also our knowledge of the chemical category wasn't as vast as it is now.
That makes sense. Travis, are there health risks and diseases linked to PFAS exposure?
Yeah, there's certainly many health risks linked to PFAS exposure. And I mean, we're just scratching the surface. So when we talk about this, we can talk about what we know definitely has associations, but then it's really wide open just because we know so little about PFAS and its real levels in people, just because there's limited information out there. I mean, we know that there's all these health problems that are rising like crazy, and then it's trying to figure out which one of those are related to PFAS, but it's hard to control for sometimes in studies because there's so many different things that can affect things. And is it multifactorial, and how does PFAS play into that? So it's like this massive question, but we definitely know PFAS causes health issues. And probably we are underestimating the harmful effects. But we know that they cause things like liver enzyme changes, decreased efficacy of vaccines, risk of certain types of cancer, birth defects. I mean, there's the list is massive of all the things that that happen here. So,
are any of them most strongly connected to the most emerging evidence? I mean, is it thyroid or cancer or developmental or fertility issues that kind of are the most in the front?
So we have clear associations between elevated PFAS levels and thyroid issues, as well as birth defects, liver enzyme changes, cancers, particularly testicular and kidney cancer. So, I mean, there's very clear associations. I worry that we probably underestimate the harmful effects just because we're basing those off of data that we have, and there's probably there's a whole world of more information that we really need to collect, understand, and it all really starts, I think, with getting more access to PFAS testing, because really the majority of the world has very limited access to testing and understanding their PFAS level.
That makes sense. And then a follow-up question to that, I guess, is are there specific PFAS chemicals that are maybe potentially more toxic or dangerous than others? For instance, I've heard of PFOA or PFOA, PFOS, however you pronounce it, PFOS. There's the 4,700 plus chemicals I've read. I don't know, only a handful of them are studied. I mean, do any primarily connect to these issues?
I think you hit the nail on the head with only a handful have really been well studied. I think that, as we expand testing and really learn more about all these different things, I think that so many associations are going to come out of it, and we're going to learn so much more. I mean, clearly now we understand much more about the main ones like PFOS, PFOA, but there could be subsets that have so many different issues that we really need to better understand. I mean, I would consider all PFAS molecules to be emerging contaminants, and you want to have as low levels of all of them as possible. There's no positive attribute of having PFAS chemicals in your body, and so I would say that the more information you know about all the different PFAS molecules and your potential exposure to them, the better. If you just do a test for one, and you either have that one or you don't, you're really limiting your ability to understand your health.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of exposure, does PFAS have to be ingested to end up in your body or blood, or can it be absorbed through the skin?
Yeah, so it probably depends a little bit on specific chemicals. So it looks like the absorption through skin is pretty limited, even though there does seem to be some skin absorption at high concentrations. The majority of it is going to be ingested, either through food or water, and often through food that lives in contaminated water, like fish. So if you eat fish that live in contaminated water, the PFAS can concentrate in the fish, and then you eat the fish, and then you get a high level of PFAS. Another common way is through dust. So dust that contains PFAS, and that can be inhaled very easily. I mean, we all inhale dust all through the day, basically. So think about it as mostly probably ingested through food, water, or inhalation. That's kind of how I would think about it. And so that includes, though, if you're cooking on non-stick cookware, if you're eating from food packages that contain PFAS, all these different ways are mechanisms of ingestion.
Is any particular mechanism higher risk? Meaning, if I cook in Teflon my whole life, how does that compare to if I have a water-resistant treatment on my carpet or my couch, and I sit on that or play with my kids on it every day? I mean, is there a difference in exposure? And I guess there may be a difference in chemical. How does that work?
I think it's probably hard to quantify. I mean, it's going to be really hard because how each individual person interacts with their environment is so unique. Nonstick cookware, it probably has to do with how you use it, temperatures, and how much flaking is there, and all these different kind of properties. The same with how, if you've got a lot of products in your house that contain PFAS and there's a lot of dust that accumulates, well, how good are you at dusting? And how that's an issue with a lot of environmental contaminants like fire retardants and things like that. They can all bioaccumulate in dust, and then inhalation can be pretty massive within that.
But Austin, that's a good point to keep in mind. Toxicity is all about the dose.
Okay.
So, when we set acceptable limits for drinking water, it's based off of the assumption of how much water a human being needs to and does on average drink in a day, in a year, and then basing their exposure off of that assumed volume.
And then to tag onto that, outside of known occupational exposures, your PFAS body burden, is a product of all your exposures through much of your life. I mean, we talked about how, compounds can have half-lives of 20 to 30 years. Well, that just means that, when that exposure stopped, that it would take 20 to 30 years for that to go decrease by half. Well, not many of our lifetime exposures have stopped. If you're living in the same area, if you're drinking the same water, eating the same types of food, it's not like all your PFAS exposures stopped cold turkey overnight. So you're a product, you're a composite of all those exposures put together. And in fact, we had, when we were bringing up the method, we tested some people from Northern California, and then we actually had some people that had a different PFAS pattern, their branched isomer pattern, and they stuck out from the crowd. And this person had grown up in Maine. And so, even though we didn't know much else about, we didn't know about the health effects, but we could say, this person was exposed to, over growing up, this person was exposed to a different group of PFAS than the rest of us. So it is, there are a lot of nuances to this.
That makes sense. Now, that brings up my next question, which is location and specific groups of people. So is there a specific group or type of people or location that is at higher risk for PFAS exposure, or is it just kind of even across the board because everybody has these products?
It's pretty well documented that fire personnel have higher exposure levels. Fire personnel may have gear that's impregnated with fluorochemistry that protects them from the fire, and they're also perhaps dealing with AFFF or aqueous film forming foam, which historically has had PFAS in it. So it is, that's one group that comes to mind right away. Fire personnel, firefighters do have multiple exposure pathways that the average office worker would not, as well as the inhalation pathway, which is the least well understood of all of them.
And kind of piggybacking on that, you asked about locations. So where AFFF was used repeatedly, and that tends to include places like military installations, and all of this also is well documented where the Department of Defense has investigated PFAS contamination at any of their sites. And then other related, places, potentially airports, or any place they had that potential for, say, a liquid hydrocarbon type fire had the potential for an AFFF release.
And is that related to, so you put the fire out, or you're practicing putting fires out, and then the runoff goes somewhere, ends up in the ground, goes into the groundwater, and then people end up drinking it? I mean, I've heard stories like that. Is that usually the case with the highest exposure?
Yeah, you're exactly right. That's what happens. It's runoff and into the groundwater, and potentially groundwater is your source of drinking water, or surface water. It runs off into surface water. So that's exactly how it happens.
Well, it's kind of scary though. It's like you don't know it's happening until your blood levels are probably much higher than the normal person in the United States or in the rest of the world, right? And so, I mean, how do you find out? You just at some point desire a PFAS blood test, or does somebody test the water? I mean, what's usually the next step there?
Yeah, I mean, you can check with your local Department of Health to understand what might be going on from these known impacted sites in your town or your city. But beyond that, yeah, it's just a guessing game who may have been impacted worse than others at this point.
Interesting.
The way I think about it, I mean, the way I look at it is, I mean, I think that I approach everything that it's impossible to understand what someone's health factors are by looking at them. Nothing about someone gives you information or data about what's happening in their body. And I've had people who I didn't think looked like a diabetic, but then they're diabetic, and I've had people who look like they shouldn't have a heart attack because they run marathons and they have a heart attack. And so I think about PFAS in the same kind of way, is that, there's just by knowing somebody's geography and their occupation, you're going to miss all these people who have exposures, who just don't realize they have this massive exposure. I mean, it could be something that somebody who, obsessively floss their whole life and their floss contains PFAS. It could be so many different things. It could be, someone who they grew up in a place that they didn't even know when they were a baby, and their mom breastfed them, and they transferred a lot of PFAS early in their life. And it's all these different things that can happen that there's no way to control for these variables. And so, I mean, to me, the only way is to really test and find out and know that baseline. Just like everything else in the body, kidney function, liver function, you don't know, and assumptions are extremely dangerous when it comes to health.
Makes sense.
And we should point out that most drinking water in the U.S., there are some hot spots, but levels are generally pretty low. It is localized. So if you test your water and you had your water tested and it comes back non-detect, under the methods reporting limits, that doesn't mean you're PFAS free. That means the water you're currently drinking doesn't have detectable PFAS.
And I'm sure and then on top of that, Andrew, I'm sure everybody has a different limit of detection, right? I mean, depending on what test you got, if you had some amount of PFAS, but then you're only able to detect, 2,000 parts per trillion when you should be detecting like 100 or 200. I'm sure that factors in, I'm guessing.
Most labs doing the testing now are in relevant ranges, but yes, it did used to factor in when the detection limits weren't quite as sensitive. But in order to be able to perform PFAS testing now for water, you have to illustrate that you can get down to relevant levels.
How do you feel the medical community? I mean, do you feel like they're becoming more aware of this and like would actually know to test if someone had some of the symptoms that we're talking about?
No, I mean, this is, unfortunately, the practice of medicine stays pretty far behind evidence. It takes a very long time for scientific evidence to actually lead to medical practice, just because of the amount of time it takes to work through scientific journals, into medical journals, into medical associations, and then into guidelines. So that's just a very, very long timeline. And so it is not very well understood or well followed within the medical community. Not for neglect, just because the medical community is just kind of slow to pick up emerging science. And so I don't think that, I don't think that people keep on their radar, okay, this person is 22 and has testicular cancer, is that because of a PFAS level? I've never seen anybody or heard about anybody doing that. But I think that, that will come eventually. We're not there yet in the medical community, and guidelines have never been formulated around that.
What's the EPA's response, Environmental Protection Agency, right? What's their response to PFAS?
Okay, I got this. So
it's about a 4-hour webinar.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
with the new administration, the PFAS action plan has gotten a revival, let's say. So they have something they've just released in October called the PFAS Roadmap. It's a strategic roadmap, and it kind of talks about how all the different divisions within the EPA are responsible for playing a role in addressing PFAS and what their action items are. So everything from the folks who are responsible for PFAS in our air, to our drinking water, to our surface water, to controlling the toxic substances that are allowed to be used in our commerce. All of them have sort of marching orders, and there are timelines associated with those when they aim to pass certain legislation, enact certain guidance. That's all outlined in that roadmap, and it's definitely kind of speeding up, I'd say, under the new administration.
That's good news. And I know you mentioned earlier about different levels for the water. What is the Safe Drinking Water Act, and how does it relate to PFAS?
Yeah, so the Safe Drinking Water Act is a really important part of protecting human health from these environmental exposures. The EPA is responsible for identifying chemicals of concern, evaluating whether they're specifically a concern in our drinking water, and then regulating them. And that happens under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so right now they're partway through the process, the rulemaking process of establishing drinking water limits for PFOA and PFOS. So just two of these compounds, but they're the two legacy compounds that were mass produced for decades and that most of the toxicology studies are based off of. So it's kind of a starting point, but they'll certainly have to make decisions about the rest of the class of chemicals as we go forward.
I do have a question about potentially the hottest topic right now about PFAS might be GenX, and also about PFBS. And I was wondering, do we have any EPA Toxicity Assessment updates on those two particular chemicals? Or I think GenX may even be a group or two or something. You explain, you're the expert.
Yeah, so as part of that PFAS roadmap, one of the things that the administration vowed to do was to develop additional toxicity profiles for more PFAS compounds than just PFOA and PFOS. So two that were on their list was PFBS, and GenX is a bit of a misnomer. That's a trade name for a processing aid, but there are a number of PFAS chemicals that are associated with it. So you'll hear GenX referred to, but that doesn't actually refer to a specific PFAS compound. So there are a multitude of compounds associated with GenX. And the one that EPA conducted their toxicity study on is one that's actually called HFPODA. So they released those toxicity assessments, and the most recent one was for the GenX, and it's quite a bit lower than the draft report we had seen earlier on. So the final report indicates a higher level of toxicity than their report on PFOA, which has been our primary concern to date.
Interesting. So you're saying lower, meaning that it takes less amount to be toxic?
Right.
And then how are they defining toxicity, though? I mean, is it harmful in a specific way to the body, or what's the determination there?
Yeah, so all the toxicity assessments are based off of what they refer to as an endpoint. So that's either a developmental endpoint or a cancer endpoint or reproductive. So they pick the endpoint and what they think is the biggest primary issue, and then they start to calculate possible exposure amounts and kind of that dosing I was talking about. And then from there, they do some further calculations to determine, well, then what's the acceptable amount that could be in your drinking water for you not to arrive at that toxic level.
And how long do they study this, and how many participants? And
they take years, which is the frustration right now. EPA is trying to conduct some studies to speed up that assessment. They call them rapid bioassays, but no results from those efforts yet. And
currently, for studies, are they just doing like a venipuncture draw of blood, or how are they?
So as far as I know, and maybe you guys can jump in on this too, there's the animal studies that they do, and then they extrapolate what the impact is from animals, what it would be on humans. And then there's epidemiological studies where they study impacted communities and see what the effects are in that way. But I'm not aware of any human health studies done on, testing done on humans.
Humans are not intentionally exposed.
Yeah.
Is that not ethical? Right.
Okay.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
So another question for you. What about PFAS blood tests versus drinking water tests? What's the difference? What do we need to think about there?
We're gonna, maybe a couple of us will chime in on this one. I think I touched on it before. A PFAS drinking water test, you should expect your lab to deliver results in the low nanogram per liter, the low parts per trillion detection range for a smattering of PFAS. A couple of years ago, that could have been a list of 24 PFAS, 36 PFAS was the norm until recently. Our laboratory can test 70 different PFAS or 72 unique PFAS in water. So that's the water really is a snapshot. It's a snapshot in time of what that water has in it, quantitatively determined PFAS. Your blood test, and maybe Travis will jump in on this one. Your blood test, traditionally has been done by a blood draw and generation of serum, and then analysis of that serum. So historically, the databases do all revolve around serum, but that's not to say that PFAS aren't in your whole blood. And so the PFAS blood test that we have now uses whole blood because it's a lot easier. It's a lot more analytically challenging, but it is a lot easier for one to get at their own blood. You don't need a phlebotomist to do a finger prick test or a heel prick test. And but it is a lower volume. So some of our analytical challenges were to meet Empower's needs, it needed to be a really small volume of blood. But we were using the latest generation of instrumentation and a lot of isotopically labeled standards to be able to quantitate PFAS in blood down to about 100 parts per trillion. And that's quite a bit lower than your PFAS or your PFOA averages are for the United States. It's something like where our detection limits are 100 ppt for many of the PFAS. The average PFOA is around 1,200 nanograms per mil. So if it's there, we're going to see it.
Gotcha. And then how do you complement those two? So do you just get the blood test, or then if I guess you're locally exposed potentially through water, you do the water test, and then if the water test is positive, you do the blood test, or what's a good flow there?
I don't think it's cart before the horse. I don't think it's one way or the other. I think Travis is going to chime in though.
Yeah, so my thought is you got two things. So you've got your active exposure, which is based on your water and other things, but largely water, and then you've got your historical exposure, which is what your blood is reflecting. So your blood isn't reflecting your exposure, in the last week, it's reflecting your exposure over years. But your ongoing exposure matters a lot too. And so, let's say you do a PFAS blood test and you're like, oh, my levels of these things are really high. I wonder if they're coming from my water, or are they coming from other sources? How do I really dial into determining that, how I stop my exposure to PFAS or reduce it as much as possible? Well, then the water testing does become an important tool to understand, okay, well, is my water the source, yes or no? And then you kind of, you move through things and you identify sources and then remove them.
So the CDC has a national average study. How does someone use their PFAS exposure results to compare to that NHANES study?
I feel like I'm taking a lot of questions.
You should. It's all you.
It's all right.
So the PFAS, there has been studies done on the distribution of PFAS in blood. And so the distribution of PFAS in blood would mean, what PFAS, what's the concentration of a person's PFAS in their whole blood versus the plasma versus the serum. So that is understood, and we're still learning more all the time. So the whole blood PFAS test, the PFAS exposure test, does have serum equivalents for select PFAS. And we're using those peer-reviewed established conversion factors to go from from whole blood into serum equivalents. We're actually also doing another study that's going to expand upon those coefficients. The coefficients meaning how do we convert a whole blood concentration into a serum equivalent. So yes, once you're in serum equivalents, you can compare to the NHANES study.
And I guess the question really is about how do I know where I'm at compared to everybody else, right? So if maybe the rest of the U.S., I guess you determine a baseline, I'm assuming, and then if I get a PFAS test, I can look at my individual compounds in my blood and then compare to what the sort of average is for the rest, and then say, okay, maybe I am 5 times higher in my PFOA than the rest of the U.S. Is that the value of the comparison?
But I think it even takes like another step to think about with this. So, if you like, people are used to getting blood results back and having a normal reference range that's normal. So, like for instance, if you get a basic metabolic panel, it'll have a potassium level on there, and your potassium level may say 3.8. And then you look over to the reference range and you'll say, oh, well, I'm normal, so that's good. But the harder thing about PFAS is that the natural human level is 0. And so anything above 0 is PFAS contamination that you've been exposed to in your environment. And so when you look at the NHANES data, you are looking at a PFAS exposed American population that that will carry some degree of health risk depending on the individual person, no matter what that is. And so you can see where you sit next to the average, but still that's just to kind of give you some guidance on scale. Your goal is ultimately to reduce your PFAS exposure as much as possible. And you may see differences in different PFAS. And so, do you have a really heightened level of one and low levels of the other, or what's the distribution? That may impact some decision making too. But, I really think it's important that people realize that match it. Like if you hit the NHANES median value, you're not in the clear and just doing great. I mean, you still had serious exposure.
And maybe that's what we need to highlight about the PFAS exposure test is, it's testing for chemicals in your body that aren't naturally occurring in your body. This isn't like a normal clinical test for vitamin D or some other endogenous chemical that your body makes. This is something that you've accumulated. So, it is an exposure test. Because your body doesn't make PFAS, as Dr. Wilkes hinted.
That makes sense. And so hopefully, as we study PFAS, we'll eventually determine, with help of CDC, EPA, I guess, that here is a specific range that's at higher risk or more toxic than not, right? So eventually, I guess we'd get to that point. But for now, the goal is to be as low as possible, and obviously lower than the rest of the U.S.
Yeah, your body levels will decrease as the exposure is removed, and so that's also what this test comes down to is choice. I think everybody would say if I had a choice, I would want less PFAS in my body because of the unknown health effects or because some of the health effects that are emerging. And so, if you don't know your PFAS blood levels, then you can look to make different choices going forward. It's tough to make choices going backwards, but you can look around your environment going forward.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So, Aaron, I have a question for you. Where can we find this PFAS exposure blood test?
Well, you can go to our website at empowerdxlab.com, order it to your home. We also have options for businesses or communities that want to order in bulk if they feel like they need to test their community. We've really tried to do a good job at getting that collection process down to a science. So it's easier on the customer to take that blood sample and ship it back to the lab so they can get their results and get the blood test results back.
That's fantastic.
To their portal.
And for our listeners who aren't familiar, it is a simple finger prick. So you just prick your finger and use this cool new miter device that kind of sucks the blood up into these tiny little fingers. I mean, it's a very small amount of blood, right? Right, team? I mean, I don't know, people, what is it, 60 microliters?
Yeah, each we send out when you order the kit through Empower, you'll receive a kit that has 4 of these tips. Each tip holds exactly 30 microliters, and that's sort of the secret science through this meter device is that it will only pull up through capillary action the exact amount of blood, and we've tested these out to be both accurate and precise.
That's fantastic. And then I think you did specify, Aaron, that we're testing for 47, I guess we're saying over 40 different PFAS chemicals, and we can get into the nitty gritty, but essentially it adds up to 47 compounds in your results, right? And then right now the turnaround time is about 10 days is what our listeners should expect? Okay. So a lot faster than probably what they're used to if they're working with a different group.
Yep. Once their sample arrives at the lab, then 10
Fantastic.
days
And then what should, if for all of our listeners who are interested in getting their organization or group connected with some PFAS tests, who do they reach out to, Aaron?
They can email hello@empowerdxlab.com or straight to me, Aaron@empowerdxlab.com. We've been getting some good inquiries, and people are very excited that the product is live. So look forward to hearing from people.
Even prior to this launch, we did have certain groups that were excited that there was a more simple solution through Empower, because if you think about if you're starting a position, if you're starting a job that may expose you to PFAS, well, you should have your baseline levels tested, because this protects both parties. If you show up for day one of the job and you have a drug screen and a background screen and a PFAS blood screen, now you have established a baseline. So your levels starting this new position shouldn't be going up over time. Your PPE, personal protective equipment, should be protecting you against further PFAS exposure. And conversely, on the other hand, if you show up day number 1 and you have very high PFAS body burden, your new employer didn't cause that. You already showed up with that. So really it's a two-way street, and it does put everyone on a level playing field.
Awesome. Well, I wanted to transition into a time of Q&A. So go ahead and find that little chat box at the bottom of the screen. If you do have any additional questions, please enter them. I have seen a handful of questions in there, and I'll be fielding them along with Aaron. So if we want to go ahead and take a look, some of them were answered along the way. Like Clay was asking about hotspot locations, and we did discuss that a little bit. Do you know if there's anywhere we can find a map or somewhere on the internet where we could maybe look it up and say, okay, here's I'm in a hotspot, or is it just looking up, firefighter foam, or what's the way to locate it?
The Environmental Working Group, EWG, they maintain a map of the U.S. of sites that they've pulled information from various databases. So a big part of their map is made up of the investigations that have been done at military installations that have found PFAS. They have a map that I think is speculative, based on industries that have the potential to use PFAS. So no data collected, but just the potential that there could be PFAS in those regions based on those manufacturing sources. So that's a place you could start. But I would encourage you to reach out to your local departments as well. Like I said, the Department of Health or your local environmental department, whether that's each state has a different name for their environmental regulatory agencies, but they can give you information on all of those kind of site investigations that have been done where they have to report that data to the state.
That makes sense. Now, next question. We had a few of these questions, a few different people asking about their products. Should they just get rid of these products now? I mean, if somebody has 6 Teflon pans in their kitchen, or they use the treatment on their carpet, I mean, if you can, should you?
I mean, I'll take one stab at this. It's so hard to know what products have PFAS and which ones don't. There are some companies that make an effort to market that their product is PFOA free, or certain chemical free. But you run the risk of those just having substitute a different PFAS chemical for PFOA. Other manufacturers don't even necessarily realize that there's PFAS in their supply chain. So it's really a tangled web that everybody's trying to untangle right now. And it's hard to know what could be in these products or not, unless you go back to some really fundamentals, let's say like stainless steel cooking pans, not treated with anything, cast iron, typically not treated with anything. Those may be safer bets.
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
Thank you. Austin, I see a question here.
Please.
Have there been any studies to determine what proportion of PFAS exposure comes from drinking water versus through consumer products or use from the environment?
I think those kind of studies are really hard to do. I mean, that's the problem, is separating this stuff out is really hard, and trying to understand environmental exposure in general is just I don't even know how someone would design a study like that, because you'd have to control somebody's whole life, Truman Show style, and that would just be very hard. That's the thing. I mean, the easiest way that I've sort of come up with to think about PFAS exposure, and really all environmental exposures, is to think about sun exposure. And so, we all have sunlight exposure, unless someone lives underground, and there's not that many people who live underground. But you could have had a bad sunburn when you were 9, and that can affect your risk of skin cancer as an adult. But you can't change that. You can't go back in time and get rid of that sunburn. All you can do now is really try to limit your sun exposure. So whether that means wearing a hat or wearing sunscreen or not going in the sun in the middle of the day. So kind of making these educated choices to try to protect yourself. But at the end of the day, you're going to get some degree of sunscreen, and then the levels at which you fortify yourself against that are tough. So I mean, you could get down to the level of making sure that you only have fish that are fished from places that are known to be PFAS, low PFAS levels or PFAS free, and check your water. And I mean, you could take all these steps. I mean, like in my house, we use cast iron and stainless steel for the reasons Taryn pointed out. You can do all these things, but you're still going to have some degree of PFAS exposure. I mean, just in transportation, you're going to have exposures.
That makes sense. And somebody did ask a question about the report, and I wanted to answer that. Is it a digital report or hard copy? It is a digital report, and it's in our secure online portal. So we'll send you an email the moment it's ready, and you'll be able to log in to the secure portal and see your results. And then, of course, you can download those results, that PDF, I believe, and print it out if you want. If you need to have a hard copy to take to local organization or group, but it is digital. And then another question here. Two people asked the same question about treatment. So I thought I heard some of our experts say there are no treatments to get rid of PFAS from your body, but is there any new evidence?
Well, that's not exactly true. I mean, you can get PFAS out of your body. It's just not in a conventional kind of way. So you can't go and chelate it out like a metal, or it doesn't pass through urine easily. So it's in your blood and in your tissue, and different PFAS have different affinities for different tissues. But the most readily available way to get it out of your body is to either bleed or to have a baby and pass it to your baby, which sounds kind of tough. I mean, it really is that level of complexity to get it out of your body. So there could be a role, and it's been studied with phlebotomy, where you actually draw blood out with the intention of lowering PFAS levels. And for people who have very high levels, that may be an effective an effective measure to get rid of the PFAS by literally, on some regular interval, getting blood drawn and a couple pints at a time and reducing your PFAS burden that way.
See one here, Austin. It's kind of a technical question, probably for Andrew.
Mm-hmm.
Why is blood more challenging as far as testing for PFAS, and how does the matrix differ from serum to serum from a challenging perspective?
So that's a good question. One of the first steps with generating serum is that you let it clot, and so the clotting is happening for proteins. And so when we have serum, it is, it's out without the red blood cells, without the hematocrit, and the white blood cells for that matter. And you've also removed the clotting factors. So you have a lot less complex matrices than you do with whole blood. So with whole blood, everything that you removed in the serum generation, you have to deal with. We're tackling that with some complex prep steps. And then also we're utilizing isotopes. One of the first steps we do when we get these samples back is we spike in our suite of isotopes and let it absorb to that tip. So then they're going to be mimicking everything that the PFAS we found in your blood are mimicking. So it's a way for us to be able to quantitate in a complex matrices with accuracy. But yeah, it's without going into a ton of detail. It posed some challenges, but we're confident in the results.
And even the lab has to be completely PFAS free, right? The kit contents everything.
Yes, for these samples, really the lab that's supporting Empower, we have a lab within a lab. There's a dedicated blood extraction area, processing area. They're also analyzed on instruments just dedicated to blood samples. So it's a very unique workflow.
Perfect.
Yeah, that concludes our live webinar for today. Please stay tuned for future PFAS webinars, and we'll be publishing this as a live stream recording on the Empower DX podcast. And so until next time, stay empowered.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.